Assalamu alaikum. This is my second lecture on the joints. In the last lectures, we discussed about the classification of the joints, in which we discussed about the fibrous joints and the cartilaginous joints. Today, we will discuss the synovial joints. What are synovial joints? These joints possesses a cavity and the articular ends of the bones forming the joint are enclosed in a fibrous capsule. As a result, they are separated by a narrow cavity, the articular cavity, which is filled with the fluid, which is known as synovial fluid. What is the consistency of this synovial fluid? This is just like an egg albumin. Hence, these are named as the synovial joint. What are the characteristics of the synovial joints? The articular surfaces are covered by a thin plate of hyaline cartilage, and the joint cavity is enveloped by an articular capsule which consists of outer fibrous capsule and inner synovial membrane. In this diagram, you can see these are the articulating surfaces of the joint, and here you can see the fibrous capsule, and these bony ends are covered by the hyaline cartilage. The cavity of the joint is lined everywhere by synovial membrane except over the articular cartilages. The cavity is filled with the synovial fluid, which is secreted by the synovial membrane, which provide nutrition to articular cartilages and lubrication of articular surfaces. Some joint cavity completely or incompletely divided by the articular disc or menisci. Now we will discuss about the types of the synovial joints. There are almost 7 types of synovial joints, which are plane joints, hinge joints, pivot joint, condylar joint, ellipsoid joint, saddle joint, and ball and socket joints. We will discuss all these types one by one. Number 1 is the plane joints. As the name indicates, here the articular surfaces will be plane or flat. And what type of movement these joints will show? They will show simple gliding movements in various directions. And what will be the examples? Their examples are the intercarpal joints in case of upper limb and intertarsal joints in case of the lower limb. Besides them, there are also the joints between the articular process of the adjacent vertebra. These are also plane joints. So, we discuss about the first type of the synovial joints, which is the plane joint, and its examples are the intercarpal, intertarsals, and articular process of the adjacent vertebrae. You should know about the examples of each and every type of joint. This is compulsory. In this diagram, you can see here, these are the intercarpal joints and these are the intertarsal joints. Okay, so these are the plane synovial joints. Second type is the hinge joint. Hinge joint, where the articular surface are pulley shaped. This type of joint permits movement in one plane around transverse axis. Means these are uniaxial joints because we can produce just one axis movement. This movement consists of flexion and extension. As you know that the flexion and extension occur in case of hinge joint. These joints have strong collateral ligaments to prevent other movements. And what will be the examples? You know, elbow joint in case of upper limb and knee joint and ankle joint. And interphalangeal joints भी इसी में आ जाते हैं. Here you can see in the diagram, in case of upper limb, this is the example of the wrist joint. Here this is the humerus, articular end of the humerus, and this is the upper end, articulating end of the ulna. Because the wrist elbow joint is formed between these two bones, so this type is of hinge variety. And you know that which type of movements occur at the elbow joint? Yes, flexion and extension. Here again you can see articulating surfaces are again shown. Third type of synovial joint is the pivot joint. The articular surface of one bone is rounded and fits into the concavity of another bone. Further rounded part is surrounded by a ligamentous ring. As you can see in this diagram, first articulating end. The articulating end of the one bone is rounded and the other have the concave surface. This rounded end will fit into the concavity, and further this rounded end is supported by the ligamentous support. In case of the example would be the superior radio-ulnar joints. Here the radius is rounded and the concavity of the ulna will fit them. And also the atlantoaxial joints. These are the examples of the pivot joint. Then is the condylar joint. This is another type of the synovial joints. Here the round articular surface of one bone fits into the socket type articular surface of another bone. The end of bone bearing round articular surface is called the condyle. These joints permit movements in two directions, means condylar joints are of biaxial type because the movements occur in two axes. What will be the examples? Very popular examples: temporomandibular joint. This one is the temporomandibular joint. And knee joint is also the type of the condylar joint variety. And again, two types of movements can occur. Next is the ellipsoid joints. Ellipsoid joints have the elliptical convex surface of one bone which will articulate with the elliptical concave surface of another bone. So the articular surfaces are concavo-convex. One have the convex surface and the other have the concave surface, but these are of elliptical shape. The movements are permitted in two directions against, as in case of the condylar variety, we discussed the movements occur in two directions. Again, in the ellipsoid variety, the movements occur in the two directions. For example, wrist joint, atlanto-occipital joint, metacarpophalangeal joints and the metatarsophalangeal joints. Wrist joint is very much common, as you can see how much movements you can do in the case of the wrist joint. Yes, one movement is the flexion and extension and second one is the adduction and abduction. So you can tell that this wrist joint is of ellipsoid joint and two types of, it means two directional movement can occur in this. Then is the saddle joint. Saddle, here the articular surfaces are reciprocally saddle shaped, that is concavo-convex. This is very commonly asked question, what is the which type of joint in your body is of saddle variety and why it is known as saddle joint. So your answer would be the articulating surfaces are reciprocally saddle shaped. That is why the joint is known as the saddle joint. And what will be the example? Very simple, the thumb. First carpometacarpal joint, or you can say the joint between the trapezium and the metacarpal bones of the thumb. So, and another example of the saddle joint is sternoclavicular joints. These two joints are of saddle variety. In this diagram, the joint is shown in the thumb. You can see this one is the trapezium and this is the metacarpal bone. Okay? First metacarpal bone. The articulating surfaces are reciprocally concavo-convex and hence these are known as the saddle joints. Now the very most popular and the freely movable joint type of synovial joint is the ball and socket joint. Ball and socket joints are very common and very easily understandable. These have, as the name indicates, their articulating surfaces will be, one articulating surfaces will be like a ball, and other articulating surface will act like a cup-shaped socket. As we can see in this diagram, the hip joint. Here the acetabular labrum, as you can see, the acetabulum has the concavity. It will act as a socket or cup-shaped cavity. And the rounded ball of the head of the femur will become approximated in this cavity, and then the stability of this joint is further enhanced by the fibrous capsule and the ligaments. So this is the example of the ball and socket joint. There is also another example of the ball and socket joint. You can see in your body, the example is the shoulder joint. What will happen in case of the shoulder joint? The rounded and upper end of the humerus will make a joint with the concavity of the glenoid cavity of the scapula. In this way, the shoulder joint is formed. This is also the type of example of the ball and socket joint. This type of joints permit movements in all planes. As you can see, the circumduction movement. You can produce the all planes in all directions in these ball and socket joints. Means you can perform flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, as well as rotation around a central axis. So the main two examples are the hip joint and shoulder joint. Here again you can see the example of the shoulder joint. This is the head of the humerus, and this one is the glenoid cavity. This will act as a socket and this end will act as a ball, and in this way these surfaces get approximated and they will form the ball and socket joint. These were the types of the synovial joints as we discussed: plane joint, pivot joint, saddle joint, condylar joint, ellipsoid joint. These are all ball and socket joint. These are all types of the synovial joints. As I told you in the last lecture, if you are asked about the freely movable joint or the joint which have more range of movement, then your answer would be the synovial joints. Now we will discuss about the functional classification. If we discuss about the functional classification of the joints, then we have three types of joints: Synarthrosis, Amphiarthrosis, Diathrosis. Now we will discuss them one by one. Number one is the Synarthrosis. Synarthrosis, as the name indicates, there will be the fusion. There will be fusion. But it will permit little or no mobility, and most synarthrosis joints are the fibrous joints, because we discussed in the last lecture that the limited mobility of which type of joint is this? Fibrous joints. And what is the example of the fibrous joints? As you know, sutures. Second type of functional classification of joint is the amphiarthrosis. Amphiarthrosis permits slight mobility. The two bone surfaces at the joints are both covered in hyaline cartilage and joined by strands of fibrocartilage. And their example would be the secondary cartilaginous joints. Means they have limited but slight mobility. The last type of the functional classification is the diathrosis. They will permit a variety of movements. And you know which joint will come under this type? Yes, synovial joints. Synovial joints are the diarthrodial of variety. Now we will classify joints according to the number of articulating bones. According to the number of articulating bones, the joints can be categorized into three types. simple joints, compound joints, and the complex joints. Simple joints have the two articulating surfaces, and the example is very simple: shoulder joint and the hip joint. Compound joint have three or more articulating surfaces. For example, the radiocarpal joints. Here, three or more bones will be involved. That is why these are known as the compound joint. Then is the complex joints. In case of complex joints, again, three or more articulating surfaces will be there. But in addition to them, what will be the difference from the compound joint? Due to the presence of articulating disc or meniscus, they are known as the complex joints. For example, the knee joints, here it is formed between the lower end of the femur and the upper end of the fibula and tibia, but also there will be the articular disc and menisci in case of the knee joints. That is why it is known as the complex joint. Then we will discuss about the terms relating to the joint movements. What are these terms? These are the extension, hyperextension, flexion, dorsiflexion, abduction. These are some terminologies. What is extension? Increasing the angle. If you are asked about the extension, you will tell that the movement at the joint in which the angle is increased. In the anatomical position, everything is extended. Next term is the hyperextension. Hyper, as you know, increased. So there will be the increased angle beyond the anatomical position. If it is present, then we will call it as hyperextension. Then what will be the flexion? In case of the flexion, the angle will be decreased. So flexion is opposite to the term extension. So in case of the lower limb, there will be the plantar flexion to point the toe, and in dorsiflexion pulls the toe up. And what is abduction? Abduction is moving a limb away from the trunk of the body or from the midline plane. If you move the body away from the trunk of the body, this is known as the abduction. And what will be the adduction? This is opposite to the abduction. If you move a limb toward the trunk of the body, this is known as the adduction. So what is rotation? Movement of a bone around an axis. It is known as rotation. And circumduction, as I told you about the circumduction, here the movement occur, almost all type of movements occur, and this is the circular movement of the distal end of a limb, which is the combination of all types of movements, which are flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, and rotation. And I told you which type of joints have these circumductory movements. Yes, ball and socket variety. Then supination, where the palm in the anatomical position, for example, palms forward. This is known as supination. And in case of pronation, palms are backward. These terminologies you must already have discussed, but this is just revision for you. What is inversion? In case of the lower limb, where the turning the sole of the foot inward. Inversion means inward sole of the foot. And eversion opposite to that, turning the sole of the foot outward. I hope you have understood all these terminologies. Then I will tell you about the parts of a joint. If you are asked about what are the parts of a joint, you will tell number one is the fibrous capsule, reinforcing ligaments, synovial membrane, articular cartilage, articular disc, fatty pads or bursa. Bursa are the flattened sacs that contain synovial fluid. And what is its function? Because it's a fluid containing structure, so it will reduce the friction. So in this diagram you can see the parts of a joint. You can see here these are the articulating ends of the bone, which are covered by the articular cartilages. For example, the hyaline cartilage. Then this one is the fibrous capsule. which have enclosed the joint cavity, and synovial membrane lining the internal surfaces or inner surface of the fibrous capsule is here, and this synovial membrane will secrete the synovial fluid which will come into the joint cavity, and this fluid will in turn act to reduce the friction between these bony articulating surfaces. And if you are discussing further the parts of the joint, these are the ligaments. These are the supporting structures of a joint which will prevent the dislocation of a joint. In addition to them, there are also bursas, which are the sacs-like structures containing the fluid. These also function to reduce the friction. So these were the parts of the joints. In this diagram again, you can see here, this is the hyaline cartilage, then synovial membrane. This one is the fibrous capsule. This would be the joint cavity containing the synovial fluid, and around them there will be the ligaments, which are the supporting structures. What are the factors which influence the joint stability? Mainly these are the bones, ligaments and the muscles. These are the mainly structures which will support the joint stability. Otherwise, the joint is unstable. This was all about the joints. I hope you understand. Thank you.